I don't want to let us think of our existing politicians and so forth as the enemies of this work. They are often as trapped by the story and the systems as we, on the outside, as it were, are. But the work to make this really hold has to be to face into that, to stand alongside them, to equip them with different ways of thinking and working.
Welcome to the Inner Green Deal podcast, where we talk to inspiring guests about the human dimension of sustainability and explore the link between our personal journeys and the positive impacts we can have on the world. My name is Tamsin Walker. In this month's episode, we're talking about you and me and everyone else, and why, as my guest Jon Alexander writes in his book Citizens, the key to fixing everything is all of us. Jon started his professional life in an advertising agency in London, but a decade in had come to see that treating citizens as eternal consumers was undermining their inherent power as individuals. He returned to university, where he has since completed 3 master's degrees, and co-founded the New Citizenship Project, a strategy and innovation consultancy operating on the belief that given the right opportunity, people can and will shape the things that matter to them for the better. To date, NCP, as it's known for short, has worked with the European Central Bank, The Guardian, and many others to shift the story of the individual in society away from that of consumer to that of participatory citizen. Since publishing his book Citizens in 2022, he's met with and heard from people all across the world who he says are finding one another, organising together, and stepping into whatever power they have to shape the future for the better. Hello, Jon, and welcome to the Inner Green Deal podcast.
Thank you for having me. Very excited to be here.
And it's a special episode, this one, because, or at least for me, because we're recording in Berlin, and not remotely as is usually the case. So it's a pleasure to meet you in person.
In person.
So yeah, place. I'd like to start with place and to ask a question that goes out to everyone that comes on the podcast, which is whether there was a place that was particularly important to you growing up, and that may be a place in nature. Not necessarily, but perhaps there was one.
Yeah. I spent a lot of my formative years in a boat, actually, rowing up and down the River Thames in Kingston in southwest London. My parents still live there near the river, and every time I'm there, I go for a run along to Kingston Bridge and back, and it feels like home. It's a kind of grounding place for me.
Nice. So we're going to be talking a lot today about Citizens. Yes. And your book, Citizens. First of all, I just anybody who perhaps is not familiar with it, I wonder if you can give us in a nutshell, what is the citizen story that you write about versus the consumer story that we're perhaps most familiar with, whether we know it or not?
I mean, really, the book in its essence is an offer of a way of seeing the moment in time we're living in through the lens actually of 3 stories: the subject story, the consumer story, and the citizen story. And I see those 3 stories really as being in competition in this moment in time, not to sort of anthropomorphize them, but we are living through a moment where those stories are in contest, I think. And just to outline them very briefly, one of the easiest ways to introduce them, a kind of historical view, where end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, I think the subject story was dominant. The subject story says the right thing to do is keep your head down, do as you're told, get what you're given, on the basis that the God-given few who run society know best, and they'll lead us to the best outcomes for society as a whole. And that had been dominant for quite a long time until that end point of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, and then really collapsed in on itself. Rise of the middle class, industrial revolution, all of that. And out of the 2 world wars that followed, we more or less consciously constructed what I call the consumer story. And the consumer story says, actually, no, the right thing to do is to pursue self-interest, because self-interest will add up to collective interest. That is how we will achieve the best outcomes for society as a whole. And so from the subject story, it's actually a very liberating shift. It's a bigger idea of humanity, bigger, but still quite small. And I believe where we are now is we're living through the collapse of the consumer story, just as the subject story fell apart before. And in that moment, what could be emerging, and the joyful possibility that I really do believe is here, is that the citizen story, which actually is a much deeper, much older story of humanity, is rising and taking shape. And in the citizen story, the right thing to do isn't just to keep your head down and do as you're told. It's not just to pursue self-interest. It's actually to get involved, to contribute your ideas and energy and resources to the pursuit of the best outcomes for society as a whole. And so it's precisely by tapping into that collective energy, that collective wisdom, that collective power, that we will create the best society. And so the book, as I say, is an offer of a way of seeing this moment through the lens of those stories. And I think a big part of the reason it's resonated with a lot of people is because it offers a way of seeing this moment that neither says it's all okay, but nor does it say humanity is broken. Like, something is broken, but it's the story, not the humans. And if we can change the story, then we can change something quite fundamental.
One thing that really stuck with me, a lot of things actually stuck with me from your book, but one thing, this 3,000 times a day that we are hit with advertising in very subtle and carefully crafted ways, I'm sure a lot of the time. But also, I mean, it's like a masses of mental and emotional and probably also physical bombardment. So that being the case, how do we start to disentangle?
I mean, I think that is the central question in a lot of ways. I'm careful with this, and I don't want to overstate the analogy, but I think there is an analogy to religion, right? Sometimes I think of it as like we live in a story that calls us to prayer 3,000 times a day, which is exponentially more insistent than any world religion, right? Sometimes people sort of say to me, well, how do we teach people to be citizens? And I'm like, no, that's the wrong challenge. Humans are citizens by nature. We're just stuck within this super insistent story that tells us we're consumers. And so the task of creating the oxygen to socially and psychologically breathe to be able to be who we most truly are is more the task than learning a new set of skills. What a lot of people say to me is that even naming these things, noticing that is a story rather than a fundamental reality, is in and of itself a really powerful thing. I think the other thing is really just starting to step into that citizen story, that citizen logic. And by the way, it's not just coming from advertising, right? But when the frame of our politics is that your role is to vote, and the way that you vote is to express your self-interest, to vote for what is in your material self-interest, that in itself is another endorsement, another validation, another expression of consumer logic that surrounds us. It's such a part of our existence that we can't even really see it.
So, I mean, the disentanglement, clearly, you laid it out there, it's not a one-step process. But it does seem, from what I can glean, with my optimistic mind, to be underway.
Oh, yeah.
You'd say so?
100%. When the book was coming out, I set up a page on my website that I've had to take down because I got a bit overwhelmed, but it basically said, invite me and I will come. And I went all over the place, mainly in the UK. Everywhere I've gone, you just peel back the surface and you find people are coming together, people are finding one another, people are building. In Grimsby, there's this, one of my favourite stories, this organisation, East Marsh United, that started just with litter picks 4 or 5 years ago now, which 10 or 15 people turned up to, and then they went for a cup of tea after. And now they've got a 6-monthly arts festival called The Sun and Moon. They've got a magazine, and they've got their own little publishing house, enabling local people to tell their own stories. They've taken over a lot of the market in the town, and most fabulously, last year they ran a community share offer that raised £500,000, which is enough in Grimsby to buy 10 houses, refit them using good local jobs, and then let them out as a social landlord, creating a sustainable revenue stream for the rest of the organisation. These things are happening everywhere.
It's amazing. But why do you think this particular moment, what's pushing people towards this kind of drive for community and taking things into their own hands?
I think it throughout human history, actually. I think whenever things aren't really working, the citizen instinct raises its head, because I think it is the deepest truth. So whenever the logic fractures, the opportunity to come together forms. But to date, it hasn't been taken. And I think what potentially is different in this moment is that we have the technologies. Like, I think the potential of the internet is a many-to-many medium that can allow us to organise and allow us to do distributed yet collective thinking and working on a global scale, probably for the first time. And yet it is also really important to emphasise that it's not a sure thing, right? And arguably the story that's on the up is the subject story. The bargain of the subject story has always been protection in return for obedience. I will look after you if you do as I say, and I will name the other for you from whom I will protect you as well. And that logic, in times of chaos and uncertainty, it's like super attractive.
But then it's all the more courage that's required to step away from that and say, no, let's band together and see what we can do as a smaller unit.
I don't want to make it sound too much like this is all about sort of small scale community self-reliance, because I think the critical work to take this beyond a kind of plucky, disparate, disconnected rising, which will happen, is happening, has always happened. The thing that will get us from there to actually a genuinely different future is the work of reimagining and reinventing the institutions of our societies to tap into that. Because what's happening at the moment is that these sorts of organisations are working and delivering and creating in spite of the existing systems and structures and rules. We were talking a bit about community energy before we came on. I think that's a really good example to think with. At the moment, there are many, many, many disparate, disconnected community energy schemes all over the world where people in local communities are building their own kind of renewable energy systems. But that cannot really be a scale alternative unless we restructure our grids, unless we change the rules on how communities can feed into a national energy system, and until we redesign to enable the distributed local to connect up. And so that, for me, is the kind of critical task in this time. It is possible, but there's very little of that stage of things really happening yet. And that's the greatest concern, I think.
Thoughts were kind of flooding in as you were speaking there. Small scale seems somehow so manageable. And we have seen so often when things get bigger, they become unwieldy, unmanageable. And then the good intention gets kind of lost. But you're hopeful that this approach of citizen agency and power can be incorporated into the higher echelons of organizational structures.
Absolutely, and I do see that happening as well. In the book I talk about the work I've done over the years with the National Trust in the UK, where actually they're pioneering some really interesting ways of distributing power to the local and then connecting that up and being a kind of networked organisation. In Holland, there's this fascinating care organisation called Buurtzorg, which means neighbourhood care, which again is a sort of distributed organisation that's networked and linked up and is Holland's premier kind of provider of social care. We've seen a kind of first wave, I think, of attempts to translate that into a political realm. What I think is happening is that there is will to work in different ways in the corridors of power. The problem is that all of the tools and structures and frameworks that we have at our fingertips actually trap us in the old ways of working. So to take, for example, like measures of success are really powerful kind of system carriers. The Consumer Confidence Index, as a measure of success of society, created in the 1960s, kind of very tightly associated with GDP. When policymakers have things like consumer confidence in their formative idea set, that traps them in thinking, well, actually, so the goal of my work must be to get people confident they can buy more stuff. And the moment you do that, you're actually facing in the wrong direction. One of the projects I'm working on is the development of what we're calling a citizen confidence index, which would actually create a measure that's about the extent to which people feel they have agency. And as we're starting to piece this work together, there's pretty good evidence that actually that is a better indicator for human flourishing than consumer confidence, fairly obviously. I guess what I'm saying really is I don't want to let us think of our existing politicians and so forth as the enemies of this work. They are often as trapped by the story and the systems as we, on the outside, as it were, are. But the work to make this really hold has to be to face into that, to stand alongside them, to equip them with different ways of thinking and working. And the joyful thing is there are stories from all over the world. Nigeria signed into law a startup act to support technology startups and so forth for youth-led companies from across the country that was crowdsourced and signed into law in 2022. Ireland has a citizens' assembly that's sort of established in its constitution. So there are enemies of this work, but there are many more open-minded, worried seekers, including in positions of power.
That is a statement that's filled with hope. But so I wanted to touch on hope. From my reading of your book, at its heart, there seems to be also a story of hope. And I wonder if that was a correct reading and what it is that gives you the hope to continue with this work.
So hope, I think, is really important and interesting and something to really stare at and think about. There's an empty kind of hope, which actually I think is deeply dangerous and is in a way a tool of the consumer story or even of the subject story, which is the sort of keep calm and carry on kind of hope, the sort of things will be all right. And there's also, and subtly different but still dangerous, I think there's a version of hope that is about sort of solely imagining a future state. And I've been thinking a lot about this recently because I've been digging into indigenous wisdoms and trying to understand what we can draw from some of the really deeper, older ideas. And there's this quote from Chief Nanawa Hunikui that I came across recently. He says, in modern societies, hope is held hostage by idealized images of the future. We need to liberate hope from this captivity so that it resides in the present, in the faith that we can heal our fractured relationship with the earth, with other species, among ourselves and within ourselves. With the earth, with other species, among ourselves and within ourselves. The future is the outcome of relationships we weave in the present. He says to make the future different, we must weave relationships differently in the present, rather than focusing on idealizations of the future that perpetuate the relational fractures of the present. And I think that is just the most perfect expression of what I increasingly think about and mean by hope. It's a sort of demand to engage differently and relate differently and to orient differently now, with the faith that is the work that will add up to a different future.
I love a lot of what you said there, and I think it changes the way you feel about yourself as well. And when you start to connect to what is on your doorstep, the people around you, then you relate to yourself in a different way, which means you relate to the entire world in a different way, which opens doors. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the work that goes on inside, because you have mentioned that too. And clearly you coming from advertising to where you are now, that's been a journey.
Something of a journey.
Transformational process. But you know, in talking about the work that goes on inside, how do you see that? I mean, maybe we touched on it a little bit just there around hope and reconnecting. What is it for you, the inside work?
In all honesty, I worry a bit sometimes about the extent of the focus on the kind of the inner work. And that's partly because of what I understand to have happened in the sort of 60s and 70s and how the inner work kind of became an end in itself. And actually, Adam Curtis in the documentary series The Century of the Self makes a pretty strong argument that in itself was a kind of consumerization of the idea of inner change. I guess my own practice, as it were, is about trying to kind of hold space to remain as grounded as possible. Like, sport is a huge thing for me. Running is my kind of meditative practice. And I guess the journey for me out of advertising was one of holding true and continuing to ask the questions I was asking even when they became deeply uncomfortable. But finding community to hold those questions with was essential to that work. Like, I don't know, actually, one of the reasons I was keen to talk to you is that this frame of the Inner Green Deal I find really interesting and slightly uncomfortable. But I guess to the extent that I feel I have an answer, I think the way Chief Nanawa puts it, like the relationship to the world, relationship to other species, relationship to each other, and relationship with ourselves are all kind of interwoven.
Yeah, interwoven. And also it makes me think of what we talked about earlier in this conversation about the 3,000 messages.
Right.
Just like developing an awareness for that. And if you are not really in tune with your own thoughts even, then how do you become aware of when you're being tapped into?
Yeah, that's right.
All right, well, moving on slightly, I'm interested also in this idea of how to engage citizens and the role of narrative. So the Inner Green Deal, one project that's underway is this handprint project, which besides the footprint, which at this stage has a fairly negative connotation, but, you know, the handprint is a much more positive thing. It's more about what you can do, maybe urban gardening, maybe get involved in energy projects. And I wonder what you make of the potential role of engaging people through positive narratives.
I think it's huge. I love the metaphor that citizenship is a muscle you build, not a cup you empty, right? And I first heard that from a very funny man called Stephen Green, who grew up in the music industry and taking some interesting substances and has a very hilarious accent. He was like, man, you gotta understand that when you start using that citizen muscle, you see yourself in the mirror and you go, oh, I kind of like that. I want to use that some more. So Stephen will hear this and want to kill me, but I think he's kind of right. And so the work isn't to come up with the sort of perfect thing, or a huge part of the work is to create opportunities for exercising that muscle. Those muscles, it's a whole group of muscles, right? Like the muscles of relationship and connection, the muscles of action, the muscles of imagination. Like they're all kind of muscles that have atrophied in the consumer era.
But they're all connected as well.
And they're all connected. There are some folk who are like, we have to define what the most effective project would be. And I'm like, kind of, but we also just need to support and celebrate where people are finding their joy together and finding what they want to do, and actually trust that the big meta benefit is actually the connection, because things are going to get sticky.
Do you have a sense of networks and momentum building and communities, projects, inspiring more communities, more projects? Do you see a rippling out effect?
I'm utterly confident that there is a building of momentum in this citizen story. Part of that comes from the reaction to my own work. I'm finding a really warm engagement from all over the place, and from institutions. I'm being invited into some really surprising places, whether that's the Singaporean government have created a new agency called the Government Partnerships Office, which is there to support citizen initiatives to sort of take hold. There's a wonderful initiative that I love that started last year just before Black Friday called Citizen Friday, with the call to action being share, repair and get out in the fresh air as a kind of kill Black Friday thing that got on TV in a couple of countries and is kind of spreading. And then beyond my work, I'm seeing more people developing more of these kind of narratives and phenomena. In the US, there's this guy, Baratunde Thurston, who is very, very funny and wonderful and charismatic. He's sort of really championing and telling these stories and connecting something in the US, which is very powerful, just by way of example. And then in terms of sort of sectors and movements, there's Kennedy Adede, whose story I told in the book since the book came out, and not, I don't think causally because of the book, but he has become like a really quite conspicuous figurehead of this concept of locally led development, which is very much a kind of citizen idea of development and philanthropy. So something is definitely building, and it is also true that it's not enough yet, and it's arguably not winning. Like the place my mind first went to when you asked the question was the fact that my book came out literally, I think, the day before the tanks rolled across the border from Russia into Ukraine. I don't want to pretend that we're not where we are, but there is definitely something very powerful building.
And what about in the climate sphere? Do you see momentum building there?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in the UK, there's a really interesting organisation called the Climate Majority Project, which is trying to build a mainstream movement that is less conventional activist kind of protest focused and more about building community power and connecting that up. There've been this wave of deliberative democracy approaches on climate that's spreading across the world. There's an organisation called the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies that's gaining influence and has members from all over the world working with governments to push them in that direction, so that the connect between deliberative democracy and climate is there and growing. It is definitely happening on climate. I think climate is probably the primary trigger for this movement, for citizening.
Really?
I think probably because it's the most obvious thing that the existing story and therefore structures and institutions have no answers for.
It's heartening though, because you do get the sense often, I mean, we talked about this as well before we started the recording, that when you particularly read international news, you come face to face with problems which are obviously much too big for any one person to even consider tackling. But I do find it really heartening then to think that people are saying, okay, can't deal with it on that scale, but what can we do, and what can we do on a scale that is perhaps beneficial to our community or to our municipality or whatever it may be.
There are big stories and small. I love the way Brian Eno wrote the foreword for my book. He said the media's radar is resolutely pointed in the wrong direction. It's pointed at the corridors of power rather than at the community. And I think the role the media could be playing, if there was such a thing as a sort of citizen media, it would be more about connecting up and trying to create the space for politics to move into, rather than just seeing its role as being to kind of hold power to account. I'm quite suspicious of this kind of hero complex, as I see it, narrative of democracy dies in darkness. I think that's the Washington Post line. That's like, sunlight is the best disinfectant. It's like, rather than setting yourself the real task of understanding, you're just giving yourself an excuse to fixate on the collapse. One last thing I want to say on that, actually. Sometimes people can hear what I'm saying and think that it's sort of idealistic or whatever. And one of the most powerful rebuttals I think I can give to that is the fact that the people and organisations who are currently arguably doing most to lean into this kind of participatory logic, to embrace what I would describe as a kind of fundamental human need for agency, are actually the far right who are co-opting it. And so the example is the QAnon conspiracy theory in the States. You go a step or two into that, as I did in the research for the book. The invitation there, the front and centre statement is, we need you. Like, here's your first task. Get involved. We're only going to be able to save this country together. Contrast that with the rhetoric of like, we'll make sure you have rising material standards of living. Vote in your economic self-interest. We're setting ourselves the wrong task. People want to understand their world they're in and create a better one. They want to be useful. They want agency.
A powerful thing to think about in those terms. I have to say, I've never really ventured deep into the QAnon.
Yeah, don't go too deep. I backed out pretty quickly.
I think I probably would too. But it is. I mean, that's also, the listening to the other side is something that we're very good at not doing, not actually giving space to understanding. And that's it. Understand the world that you're in, but that means understanding more than your own perspective.
It was an incredible kind of clunk moment for me when you're like, oh, these people are doing this stuff not because they are by character kind of hate-filled. They're doing it because they're desperate for agency and someone is offering it to them.
All right, so I guess, what's next?
What's next for me? I think my role is becoming more of a storyteller and kind of pollinator, and like I've seen the impact that going and telling these stories has. So going back to this thing about like, how do we create the tools and frameworks, and how do we challenge the tools and frameworks that are super embedded? So at the moment I'm developing relationships with a couple of different universities in order to work with the academics to kind of hack some of the old frameworks. So with a business school to try and challenge the old concept of the 4 Ps of the marketing mix. To me, that is a cognitive trap. It means that anyone who does a freaking MBA, because every MBA course in the world teaches that framework, then can't do anything but think of people as consumers. So I'm trying to work with a business school and maybe a network of business schools to put the evidence base to the sort of systemic corruption of that thing and try and replace it with what we call the 3 principles of participatory organisations. Something that is about how do you build an organisation around the concept of agency rather than around the concept of material standards of living. Working with a school of government on this idea of a citizen confidence index, like trying to do this sort of work, because academia is very well equipped to further knowledge within a paradigm. It's not particularly well equipped to articulate frameworks within a new paradigm. But there is hunger in that world because they all know that they're going down deeper and deeper, kind of more arcane byways of a broken system. So I'm finding some appetite there. And I'm hoping to kind of complement that with more of the storytelling work. I think of myself less as what I would call a storyteller to citizen storyteller, and more as a storyteller to storyteller. I think I'm very well placed to find some of these stories and offer them up so that the Baratundes and the Brian Enos and the Tamsin Walkers of this world can tell them to bigger and broader audiences. One of the ways I've thought about it, and I'm playing with language, so I welcome the feedback from you and your audience. I think of myself as a kind of open source researcher of a citizen future. One of the ways I articulate it is I feel like I can see a future that too few other people can see, and I want to make more people able to see it, because only if we see it can we build it.
I think it's great endeavor. Okay, my very last question, which is one that everyone gets. If you could bestow a single skill upon everybody on planet Earth, what would you choose that skill to be?
Easy as pie, facilitation skills. Like, if I could snap my fingers and make one change in the world right now that I think would be transformative, it would be to overnight equip every elected politician in the world with deep facilitation training.
What would they come out with?
They'd see their role differently, right? Like at the moment, I feel like like if the moment you're trained in any kind of facilitation skills, really, you come to see your role not as to do for, but to do with, to hold questions that people then find their own answers to, rather than to find answers and sell them to them, to create space that enables people to be the best version of themselves rather than to impress them. Like that. Imagine if we had an idea of politicians as facilitators rather than as representatives.
Imagine. That one gave me the shivers as well. It's a powerful thought.
Great question.
Yeah, well, it's a great answer. And actually, you're the first person who had it right there on the tip of the tongue. So thank you so much for your time and for all of these insights.
Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed listening to Jon's thoughts and insights as much as I did. If you want to know more about his work or read Citizens for yourself, you'll find links in the show notes. I'll be back next month with a new episode of the Inner Green Deal podcast. If you want to hear other interesting conversations with people working on sustainability and the establishment of deeper connections to ourselves and the world around us in the meantime, you can take a walk through our archives. And as ever, if this conversation captured your imagination, we'd love you to share it and subscribe to the podcast. Thank you for listening. I look forward to you joining me again the next time. For now, though, bye-bye.